Hi, this is the Celestial Report. Very early in the morning for some of us, and but we have our coffee and we're ready to go. My special guest this morning, and I know it's something that we've been looking forward to for a long time, is David DuByne of Adapt 2030. And I know that many of you came up to me during Branson and said that you followed his work. And so we're teaming up today to answer your questions on the grand solar minimum. And welcome, David.
So I would predict Canada is going to be one of the first places where power grids are going to start going down, or in the United States in the more northerly latitudes right toward the Canadian border, start to look for at least one or two grids to go down. And I would say this year might be the year or next. I've been saying this, so many others have too. I'm not the only one saying talking about. But again, that's the whole reason when I started a conversation here, if it gets exceptionally cold, I mean, what are people going to do? They're going to draw more power. But our power grids are held together by duct tape and baling wire, basically. They haven't been upgraded. They haven't been upkept. There's a few areas that have, but almost all of it's almost like they're just not doing anything because they know it's going to fail. That's the only, and I know it might be too woo-woo to talk about that, but I really believe a lot of the non-upkeep of our infrastructure is because the leaders of power know that when we go into this, that they're not going to be needed anymore, or there's going to be a huge shift. So why fix something if it's not going to be used and people are going to move away from these areas? Why would you bother fixing the bridges? Why would you bother upgrading the power? I'm sure they know the cycles far better than we do. And, you know, FEMA knows it and other government institutions know it. It's just the average person on the ground that doesn't know it. Everybody else in continuity of government knows it, and they're all preparing. So why aren't they taking care of our power grids or bridges?
So I've been attended as Homeland Security and FEMA webinars on that. And there are redundant systems that have been installed, but it would be for infrastructure management, not really for the average person. And I guess my take in the overview of that is that they do know the shift is coming. They want to jump to a different type of infrastructure that's artificially intelligence operated. They're trying to look at that. So why invest in an old technology when they want to push people to this new technology that they're planning? Of course, that would be highly controlled. It would be global governance. You would not be able to use it unless you agreed to buy into that agenda. So I think that we're just on the cusp of that right now. That's just my take. So I've got two more questions and then we'll jump to some other topics. But I know that you and I have folks in the Hawaiian Islands and also Australia. What's your take on the safety of those locations?
I lived in Hawaii for years myself. I lived on Maui. We had to import 98% of everything we needed every day. An indigenous population going back into the 1700s or 1600s before there was contact, if you will, the island populations were rather small. They were able to fish and grow taro and quite a few other vegetables and that sort of thing. They raised, there were hogs out there and whatnot. But if there's no deliveries coming in, I think about Maui. When I was there, it had about 200,000 people on it. If we were going to live indigenously out there with no imports coming in, you'd have to knock that down 10 times. So even though it is warm, it's abundant. If everybody had to go start fishing offshore and poke fish, as you know, spear fishing is what they called, there'd be no reef life left within like a couple weeks. And it's unsustainable the way it is right now to get all this container goods over there. It's a great location, I must admit. It's tropical. It would definitely, be a place to be if the population was greatly reduced and it was really down into just tens of thousands of people on certain sides of the island versus 100,000. And Australia, you know, that's a vast continent. I mean, there's all people been there for how many hundreds of thousands of years. So obviously that's a goodie. It just depends on where you go. Because I had a really great discussion with somebody about the record rainfall occurring in the north part of Australia and the center part out there in the outback. But then you go down to the grain growing areas, southern Australia, Victoria, especially around Mallee, drought. So it's a continent. You got massive rainfalls happening in the north that they haven't had in hundreds of years. You got a massive drought going on down in the south. So if you could find that sweet spot somewhere in Australia that you, it's up, I haven't done that much research on where it would be, but I would imagine it'd be northeast because the intertropical convergence zone shifts up there and the Chinese are putting in a bunch of new cattle ranching up there. So I'm always like, follow the Chinese money. They know the cycles way better than most of us out here. So wherever the Chinese are investing in these seemingly bizarre, super dusty, like end of the road places, those are going to soon to be not so dusty, soon to be free range cattle areas. So follow the Chinese investments into the deserts and the far reaches of any continent because they know the cycle's repeating. The only reason a lot of people aren't living way up in northern Australia is because, well, it's just too dry, and it's when you're talking about Queensland and you're talking about northern Australia, way up in the outback. That is such even if they had roads, I mean, it's such a different climate. I mean, impossibly different. You can grow things down, you can't really grow up. But now think about everything up toward the equator is getting much wetter. That's all. I don't have an answer for that except just do your own research.
I've got some friends that do live in Australia, and they said that the Chinese are very interested in buying land down in Australia to the point that the Australians are very concerned about that. There's a little bit too much of an interest right now. So let's jump into something else right now that I know a lot of my followers want this question answered. What's your take on the expectation or the timeline for cannibalism?
Well, to start off, cannibalism is common. It's not rare. It happens every famine it happens. So when we look through history, they've tried to teach us that, ooh, it only happened with one time, or did this one thing one time, and like religions tell you not to eat other people. The famines happen all the time, and when they do, they consume. Well, the rule is don't eat your own family member or don't consume the flesh of your own family member. So here I had some accounts from the Bosnian War. Now, there was some cannibalism that went on down there at the time, but it wasn't widespread. But again, like somebody would die and they're like, I can't eat my family member. But somebody else would take their family's thigh or something, part of not the whole body or anything, but they would take select parts of the human. It's more common than you possibly can imagine. During times of duress, it happened during World War II. I mean, look at the siege of Leningrad, the siege of Stalingrad. Cannibalism was rife there. Again, the same thing. They didn't eat family members, and it got so cold. And you know, I'm reading these Stalingrad and Leningrad. You need to read these accounts of this point. Before the cannibalism really set in, they were eating the glue off of their wallpaper. Because back then, you know, the glue was much more healthier. You couldn't eat the glue off your wallpaper these days, but back then you could. And they were going into bombed out sugar mills and like eating the dirt because the sugar after it got blown up was in the dirt there. And they had gone through every possible recourse. They even were trading recipes to boil belts, like, you know, a belt. But again, there's too many toxins in today's leather processing that there weren't back then. So you can't even eat your belt today or your shoes. It would be too toxic. But back then you could. And actually, we're trading recipes on how to cook shoes and belts, and they were eating fur coats and, you know, all kind of stuff, you know, because you could prepare the fur coats and whatnot in recipes as well. Couldn't eat the actual fur, but the inside, the skin and stuff was edible. So before that, they went to that point before they started eating human flesh. And the rule was, again, you can't eat your own family member. So when people would die in the middle of winter, they got frozen solid. So they would trade like corpses that were frozen and then take them to another part of the city. And, you know, you think it's rare, but it happens all the time. So I don't know exactly what it would be. And again, like on certain standpoints, I would rather starve to death than eat another human myself. Like, I think your body and your mind can work together, because I would choose to check out before I have to start eating people. And I never intend to be in that situation anyway, because I intend to prepare. And that could be a great thing too, is prepare a little bit so there's no cannibalism later. You know, that could be a new catchphrase, because even a little bit of food can keep your body going for much, much, much longer than you anticipate it to. Like, we're so used to overgorging on all this food to keep us going with 2-3 meals a day. You know, intermittent fasting is a good thing. And, you know, your body doesn't need as much food as they tell you it needs. And if you start looking back in history, there's a lot of truth to that. But I think cannibalism, I don't have an exact answer on the years, but if it were to start, I would say 2028, if I have to put a year to it.
Okay, do you think that, given that they're putting human material in food products right now, like genetic human genes in tomatoes, human genes in rice, that we're kind of being conditioned towards cannibalism?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Food?
And again, you know, look at, A, the food supply, but B, look at all the news headlines coming out. It's almost like they're preconditioning people now to be able to, you know, euthanize people and then use them for Soylent Green kind of things is now being talked about by PhD professors. And they're actually talking about everything that's aborted we could turn into food. And it's just like, what? You would have been arrested a few years ago. You go back 20 years, at the turn of the century, 1999, the year 2000. If that professor was to come out to say that back then, he would have been fired, lost his tenureship, maybe been arrested, Jeffrey Dahmer kind. And then, you know, these girls coming out saying, oh, we need to eat all the aborted fetuses, and we need to eat all these, and they're pre-programming the mind to get you ready to accept such a thing. So, you know, with this cannibalism, I know it's coming. I feel it intuitively. In the modern minimum, they had something called human traps. And actually, that was more, I'm going to step back. That was more like the spore minimum back in the 1300s. And Sasha Dobler has all the best information on that. He runs the Abrupt Earth Changes website, and he's got that full Grand Solar Minimum in the 14th century. Huge book that he wrote, about 120 some pages on there. But he talks about human traps being in there. So that's really one of the reasons that people always traveled in bands together. Nobody really went out alone, because you could very well disappear as a food source.
What is a human trap?
Well, it was just like we trap animals now today with nets, and, you know, you fall in a pit. They would catch people and eat them. That's crazy. Yeah. But it happened. And you see it all through history. You know, you go through even back into the early 1800s, or even more recently, you know, there's still cannibalism around in different parts of the world that was on the ceremonial side of thing, after a battle with somebody, with eating the heart and whatnot. But in terms of just sheer hunger, where we need to eat somebody, what were those guys that crashed in the airplane, the soccer team or the football team that crashed up, and, you know, they turned to it too. Like, these are modern humans that you would never, ever, ever would have think of it. But when it came down to them dying or eating some of their, you know, other people had died naturally anyway, so that was a food source. It was stored, it was frozen up there in the mountains. You know, so how far down the rabbit hole does the mind need to go to consider that as an option? And are we programmed, or is our DNA already at that base level set where we default to that as a survival mechanism? And when the repercussions coming out of this too, like, you got to realize this grand solar minimum is not going to be forever. We're going to come out of this thing. And what are the repercussions going to be on the finger pointing and the guilt and everything because you consumed human flesh during that time? As we come out into more bountiful crops again in the 2030s, I mean, what kind of, you know, I don't know, society-wise, you know, if a large percentage or even a 5% of the world turns to cannibalism, like, how is that going to reverberate through the society and a rebuild on its own? I mean, there's a lot of psychological issues to deal with this when you're talking about consuming literally parts of a human to stay alive. I don't know, but my thing is, along with Valentina Zarkova, we literally will not have enough food to feed this planet long before 2028. We're talking like She is of the volition governments right now need to start preparing and setting aside food for 2028 to 2032 food shortages. And she's calling on, that's almost 10 years in advance. She's like, you need to start preparing now on the mass scale that a government can prepare for us to get through this. Now, what do you think it's going to be like around 2028 then? It scares me a little bit to think about it. That's why I am preparing, learning my skills, my indoor vertical gardening. You know, actually, it's getting really cold outside and a weird fog all over the place. So we're starting to bring the plants in this weekend. Like tomorrow, we're going to bring them in. We're setting up our plastic in the troughs, and we got the 3 different grow lights that we're going to put on top there, and we're going to bring some of it inside. And we got a couple tubes we're going to bring in as well and stack them up. And, you know, just use the front room here. And then we got a dehumidifier and we have a fan. So we're going to see what we can do this winter. And, you know, what are you growing inside? What are you finding about mold and wetness issues when you're trying to grow inside? Because you have an enormous amount of plants in your house there that you're growing. So what are you doing to keep them in check in terms of mildew and mold?
Well, see, I don't have quite the problem that you do because I am heating with wood. So that dries I don't need a dehumidifier because I basically am heating with wood. So I put a kettle of water on to keep the humidity up. Otherwise, that will stress the plants just as much as the humidity. You're doing great with the fans, and the proper lighting will deter bugs. So those 2 things are critical. That said, we are so we are in this time of contrast. So you're either going to have an excessive drought or you're going to have a really high humidity. Typically, our humidity in the summer runs, I would say, 5% to about 9%. This year, it was running 80 to 90% because it just deluge. And so outside and inside, I had a heavy mold and fungus. And historically, it's like biblically, I'm speaking, and through history, blights. And blight is a form of fungus. So it is something that if you do live in a region that is deluged, then you will have to combat the mold and the fungus. The best way that I know that's actually good for your plants is sulfur. And so I'm buying large bags of sulfur. And not only is it a plant nutrient, but it will kill the sulfur. It's also like an antibiotic for people. It's what some of the pioneers used to use for treating people bugs. So those are some of the things you can sprinkle the sulfur on, dust it on, like with like a salt shaker, or something finer if you want, and just give your plants a light dusting. Actually, your tomatoes and peppers, if they're out in the greenhouse, it gets kind of humid in a greenhouse anyway, they really like it because it's a food nutrient. So I would just say, highly recommend anybody that has a humidity issue or foresees a humidity issue to get some large bags of sulfur. And we have to really be realistic that our supply chain may go down. So right now you can buy 40, 100-pound bags of sulfur, but you may not be able to do that in the future. So it is something that you would want to store. It does not have a shelf life, so you don't have to worry about it going bad. It's kind of like diatomaceous earth. The only thing that you would want to do is ensure that it did not get wet, because then you'd have to maybe it won't hurt it, but then it makes it a little bit harder, because then you might have to use a hammer and chop it up, hit it with the hammer to get it powdered again. So so you did have some questions this past week.
One last one, Celeste, here. Baking soda as well. Using baking soda for remediation for pests, as well as different kind of mold and fungus on the leaves. What about baking soda? Because I use that occasionally because it's super wet where I live. It's always 100% or 90s, or living by the coast, and it's a real humid island anyway.
So there's like 200 things that you can do with baking soda. So everything from medicine to plant care. So baking soda, and if you have any ruminant animals, that's an animal that like chews its cud like a goat or a cow. It's great. And people can take it too. So you can't have too much baking soda. And one other thing to really invest in and has multiple benefits for humans, animals, and plants is Epsom salts. So most people are magnesium deficient, and plants get, if you're growing an indoor garden, your plants can go magnesium deficient. And how you would notice that is if you started getting some chlorosis of the leaves, it may be due to overwatering, it may be your lighting. But the other thing to consider is if your plant or your crop has been in a pot for a long time, that it might be that it needs some magnesium. So you've got to look at your trace minerals when you are growing over a long period of time indoors. Like I know my coffee plants like iron, so I've stocked up on a little bit of iron and some other trace minerals. And you can think outside the box of these things, like for calcium, with the cosmic rays and the disruption of our calcium channels, and that happens in the plants too, is that you need to uptake your calcium level. And the reason is because radiation does this weird thing to plants and humans and animals. It tricks the body into saying, it's like dangling a carrot. Oh, I'm here. And the let's say human thinks that, okay, it's time to uptake this calcium, but then it tricks it. It does a bait and switch, if you will, and then you uptake the radiation instead. And then your body slowly gets depleted in calcium. Well, the same thing is happening with your plants. So we need to feed our plants calcium, and you can do that if you have extra milk. You can do it with, some people do it with eggshells. I'm a little hesitant with the oyster shells unless you're getting from the Atlantic. I just covered a story this week that it showed that there were radiation signatures in all the wine that was grown in California, and it wasn't just from Fukushima. It was radiation going all the way back from the United States nuclear testing. And it showed up in the grapes. You should check it out. I just covered that this week. So, now we've got some questions that people want to know in the situation the time that we're entering, about Faraday cages and protecting. Are Faraday cages going to be effective against this cosmic radiation that's bombarding the Earth? And I know you know a little bit about that.
Well, I know a little bit enough to say yes. And again, when we started our conversation here, even if you don't have a cell phone that you put in there, mobile phone, smartphone, whatever, if you have communications equipment that you can keep in there, shortwave radio, ham radio, CBs, walkie-talkies, and these kind of things, because you got to remember the particle bombardment event, that energetic event that's going to actually destroy your electronics. It's not going to be forever. It's going to be for a very short amount of time. So you have to protect it against the bombardment of these rays. Now, at the time after this energetic event is finished, you can actually just open that thing up and the wires are going to still have some charge on them depending how long the event is. You'll have to wait for the charge to dissipate. So, for example, off the high tension wires, it's like usually a 2 volts per kilometer is going to be charging extra on top of that. And it depends on how long the extra wires are. They have to be longer than 100 feet for them to hold charge. So anything that has a real short wire in it, maybe the like the headphone wire here, or just a cable or from the electric cord from my computer to here. It won't hold charge. But you're going to need to keep those electronics protected. And the way you're going to do that is online. There's an enormous amount of DIY videos on how to build a Faraday cage, or if you want to buy one. But the biggest factor is making sure that thing gets no signal in it. So after you build it and you think it's up to snuff, that, wow, we built this thing, it's solid, it's tight, you got to put the electrical tape around, or the aluminum tape around everything, it's sealed up. You want to have a radio or a phone in there, and you want to try to call it or turn it on, because every signal has to cease out of that. There can be zero signal coming into, even if it's only one bar in the mobile phone, that's a failure. You're going to get everything fried in there. And the larger the Faraday cage, the better. And again, people sleep in these things because, again, it's all about electromagnetics. So people sleep in them. Your brains are electromagnetic. When people try to mask their cells from different signals, they're staying inside there. So some things have RFID chips, and if you cover that up there, it will make you disappear off the radar, literally. So I know some guys who travel with passports. Your passport's got an RFID chip, and it's linked to you. When you put it in, even just copper sheeting, you disappear. It freaks people out when you come back in the airport and you suddenly pop back on the radar again, like, how'd you disappear and come back on? But copper is your number one thing. And, it's got to be the solid copper. I know they have the ones that are more mesh, but those are real specialized with grounding wires and everything else to make sure that even though there's air gap in it, that it's still protected in some outer. So it's not just you're going to put up a fence of copper and then hope for the best. It's like that's what's inside to double shield what's inside the main sheeting outside. So some people are using large storage devices like containers. But again, that's very specialized. You need to make sure that everything is sealed in there, and even missing like one little tiny 1/8 of an inch of a crack somewhere, and you're going to get everything fried. It literally needs to be 100% coverage. So some of the DIY stuff is trash cans, but I'm not sure exactly how good they would work in a real heavy situation, bombardment situation. Think about the Carrington event times 10, and then take it to that level for your base minimum preparedness. But the things that you can buy online, and I encourage you to watch the videos because you can do it much more cheaply as long as you take the precaution to double check, triple check, quadruple check, and then check it again. Because if you have those electronics, now think about that. If you have communication devices and other people were smart enough to have Faraday cages to protect their communication devices, suddenly you have a network of people communicating again in different parts of the country, different parts of the city, within the neighborhood. Because if you have walkie-talkies, for security purposes, you would be probably one of the only ones around with walkie-talkies. So even in that short range of, say, a quarter mile away, something, you'd still be able to put up a perimeter and have much better security and be able to warn people. A quarter mile away is a very long distance for people to get warned, to get ready for something coming. Even if you're driving, it still gives them an extra minute or two over rough terrain. And if somebody's walking, riding horseback is still going to give you a few minutes to get something ready. So communications devices protected in a Faraday cage, and yes, they do work. Absolutely, they work. I mean, our government's surrounded by those things. Do you think we put some of our most fragile tech inside those things? At a moment's notice, you close the door and it's totally locked in there. And you know about that with FEMA too. They got all kind of servers and everything inside these Faraday cages for this exact same purpose. Click the line, close the door, we're ready. And it took about that 5 seconds, right? So if our governments are preparing with massive Faraday cages inside granite structures in mountains, you should be doing something on the smaller level too, the size of a sofa. You can put an enormous amount of stuff in that, or the size of one of the boxes at the end, a trundle box at the end of the bed, something that size. You can put an enormous amount of stuff in there.
Do you know if there's a paint that people could paint their rooms? I know that you're interested in learning about 5G and protection on that. And I know that this is a little bit different rabbit trail to go down, but just quickly, is there a paint that kind of would protect against electromagnetic bombardment, whether it's nuclear or 5G or cosmic rays?
Yeah, there are. But, again, I would not put my faith in just a coat of paint to stop that. That coat of paint on the outside of something and on the inside before you start to put the copper sheeting in there, great idea. After you seal that thing up, if you have the extra paint, why not actually seal the aluminum tape edges so those there's no edge on it, it's completely blocked up on the way. You could use that as a double sealant on top of. I would say yes at that point, but just to paint my room and be like, well, I hope that everything survives. That might be a little sketchy on that part, because even if there's some kind of minor earthquake at the time that this thing happens, if your wall cracks, then you just lost your protection. And 5G also, I know a fair few guys into the 5G awareness over in the UK, and 3 of them specifically are saying that nothing stops 5G except Earth, like us going into a cave, or wet leaves.
Yes, wet leaves. Yeah.
Wet leaves. Nature is our protector again. When we run to caves or we're surrounded by wet leaves in a forest, we're protected from 5G.